It's not just radio, it's Rockland World Radio. RocklandWorldRadio.com. To spark lively discussion about a variety of everyday topics from the viewpoints of spirituality and metaphysics, this is New Perspectives.
And hello, and welcome again to New Perspectives Radio. I'm your host, Anton Bluman. I'm here with my co-host, Rory Pinto.
Hi.
And we're very pleased to have as our special guest, Dr. Michael Finkelstein.
Well, thank you for having me here with you.
Our pleasure. So, by way of an intro, we're especially pleased because we're all holistic practitioners. And in terms of Michael, he's board certified in internal medicine and integrative holistic medicine. And for over 2 decades, he's made a substantial contribution to the field, which is a growing field. He's the founder and director of Sunraven, a holistic healing and living center in Westchester, and the author of 77 Questions for Skillful Living, A New Path to Extraordinary Health. And I've read this book and I've met Michael a number of times, and it's a very substantial book. And what I believe he's saying, amongst other things, is the path to optimum health and wellness is through what he calls skillful living, which really includes a commitment to developing comprehensive skill sets in all aspects: mental, physical, emotional, environmental, spiritual. It's like a dynamic balance. It's about identifying the right path for each individual, and for each individual to take control of their lives. It's about seeing health challenges as opportunities for learning and growth, and that everyone has a potential for greater health. Dr. Finkelstein's background includes Chief of Integrative Medicine at Northern Westchester Hospital in Mount Kisco, and a fellowship in Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona with Dr. Andrew Weil. Also, he's had his own radio show, The Skillful Living Room, and maybe you can mention the evolution of that for yourself, Michael. And just to finish up by saying for now that he is a noted resource and a frequent lecturer. And he has a monthly newsletter called Moon Letter, based on the relevance of health and moon cycles at his practice. So, again, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Anton. Rory, thank you.
And I just wanted to kick it off by asking you a question.
Well, actually, tonight's show is Medicine of the Future, and we'll be talking about what that means.
You're right. I should actually give the official
show title would be nice.
Title of the show, which is Medicine of the Future, a holistic approach to optimal health through self-care and skillful living.
To sum it up. So, Medicine of the Future implies that it's, in some sense, that it's already happening, that the whole evolution of a holistic approach to healthcare and medicine is something that is, at least in my mind, is getting some traction. Maybe you could tell us a little bit how that happened for you and what you brought to Northern Westchester Hospital. It's an amazing story how their integrative medicine program developed. So using your own life path as an example, tell me about the medicine of the future that's happening right now.
Well, thanks for asking that question, because I think it's the crux of what I try to convey when I speak to people, whether those are my patients or an audience such as those of you listening right now. The idea for me is that we're always in a state of development and an evolution as a society, as individuals in a society, and that when we look back at history, we see the evolution of all of our institutions and we can identify distinct periods of time quite often when there have been important paradigm shifts. For instance, the current paradigm of Western medicine perhaps can be identified with in the age of Descartes, where he started to look at the body as a machine, as individual parts that can be looked at more carefully with the evolution of the microscope and other lenses that got us into finer and finer detail. But in that process, several hundred years ago, was lost the holistic viewpoint that those parts are connected, not only to each other, but to something even beyond the individual. And what I noticed in my practice of medicine was that I was doing a good job with that very reductionistic, physically oriented approach, but seeing its limits by understanding that even though I helped people sometimes, more often than not, I gave them crutches to continue to limp around as opposed to really get past the ailment into a future marked by greater function, greater vitality, and a sense of wellness that wasn't really completely dependent on the physical body itself. To me, it was a spiritual growth and evolution that needed to come back into medicine. And it was around 1999 or so, 2000, when I started to get frustrated. That's when managed care started to sort of infuse itself into medicine, where the practice of medicine was being reviewed by automatons in distant offices somewhere and telling me as a doctor that I could or could not prescribe that medication or order a test. And it was becoming very upsetting to me that I would have to defer to somebody who wasn't even in the room, not to mention what I was experiencing for my patients who were being run around and often delayed in their care and limited. So I started to really look back at what I was doing, but I was not really helped at that point. I was really just frustrated. 2001 came along, and on 9/11, the actual date 9/11, well, we clearly know what happened in the world that day. I had an appointment on my calendar. Obviously, I didn't have that appointment because it was disrupted by the world events. But a man in Mount Kisco decided that he wanted to help Northern Westchester evolve by giving it a lot of money so that it can develop an integrative medicine practice. Well, that was now 13 years ago almost. And the president of the hospital said to me, "Michael, this is a great gift, but I don't know what he's talking about." Integrative medicine back then was not really on anyone's radar screen. Though the way it was described really sounded good, which was to help people, beyond the physical and to integrate all the different modalities that might be available. And at that point, with that gift and with the impetus to help the hospital develop that program, I went back to school to study integrative medicine. And that's when I studied with Dr. Andrew Weil at the University of Arizona School of Medicine, the program in integrative medicine. And as soon as I started to take that program, the lights went on for me, which was that there is another way of practicing medicine, which is not to deny the pursuit of our and goals of healing our physical body, but was to couple that with life skills that would help us appreciate why we have this physical body, and then even if it doesn't get fixed completely, how we can still be healthier and happier. It was much more hopeful to me because I realized that in my pursuit of medicine, sometimes I couldn't help people beyond a certain point. And then I felt that it was a failure, that it was a letdown. This gave me another option, another set of options to help people see beyond the physical and to truly integrate not just another physical practice like massage therapy into Western medicine, but the mind-body and the spiritual practices and the social connections that we need help with and the concerns about the environment and the world and the universe that I think also need to be included for this medicine of the future. And so, as you said, I think that it dawned on me that the future is now, and as soon as people embrace this is the new medicine defined by health in a different way, health being how I feel, how I function, and that includes everything that I've ever experienced and everything that you're experiencing.
So along with that perspective, can you say something about the kind of patient who shows up having already tried, let's say, mainstream medicine, tried different therapies, and was dissatisfied, as you were dissatisfied in that way?
Yeah, well, I think when people get to that point of frustration, either because they're still not feeling good despite all the things they may be trying, which is not only Western medicine, but they could be pulling together a lot of other approaches and still not feeling like it's coming together. There are those people who are afraid of Western medicine in particular, the medications, the side effects, surgical procedures, the injuries. They don't trust the medical establishment. Sometimes they don't trust physicians. So they look for somebody who has a broader perspective and somebody who's willing to speak to them directly and spend the time to get to really know them. So a lot of people come to me when they feel they need a little bit more thorough, investigation, exploration of the variables that they sense are in play. But when they only have an 18-minute visit with a doctor, that's really not enough. And they see so much information out there on the internet, as an example, or through speaking to friends, family, colleagues, and the like. They're confused by the almost endless number of choices. Yeah. And they need or value somebody to help them organize all of that in an approach. But what I do is, I don't give them an answer, I'm helping them order from a Chinese menu, column A, B, and C. The first thing I do is I ask them questions. And the first question that I ask them is, let's assume I could snap my fingers and give you your health all back. What would you do with your life now?
There we go.
And that's the question that helps me help them see, well, what's the point of all of this anyway? And when people get the point, they understand why it's important to pull it together. And then some of the ambivalence about working on it is neutralized so that they could muster the energy they need to actually follow through.
It's kind of like the rudder on a ship. You have in your book you talk about having, when you walk into the unknown with passion and purpose and intention, you grow with every turn. But I wrote that down because I thought it was a nice summation of exactly what you're talking about. That if you have a sense of purpose and meaning, then everything organizes around that, including the state of your health. I had a mentor years ago who lived to be about 98, who had the worst diet in the world. Campbell's cream of mushroom soup every day. But he's one of the people that had the strongest sense of purpose. And that's really what carried him through. And he had very few health problems. He got a little frail in his 90s, finally. When he was in his 50s, he would outplay the 20-year-olds in basketball. He just was one of these forces of nature. But it's really not just about a slavish formula of health or alternative health. It has to do with this, why am I here? Who am I and why am I here? Crisis often brings us to explore that dimension. It's usually the wake-up call that makes you try something new. But that's really what's driving the ship of health. And it was amazing to see it in this mentor of mine.
Yeah. Well, what I think people like that show us, and I learned a lot also from my older patients. I looked at them very carefully. How did you get there? I didn't take credit for any of it. I just said, you're 95 years old. Let me study your life because you're going to teach me something. And what I found in people like that, and like your mentor, was alignment. Was that they were in a form of alignment. They weren't necessarily following anyone else's rules about diet or exercise and other things that we use now, but they were in alignment with a life purpose, and they were who they were. And so there was a lot less friction around them. And friction to me is inflammation. And in a lot of our discussions about health and healthy living and healthy advice, we talk about anti-inflammatory, inflammatory. To me, it is an important subject. But our first point of inflammation is when we're swimming upstream, when we're not following a life purpose. Sometimes we don't even know what it is, or we're bucking it. We're sort of resisting certain forces within ourselves, and as a result, we then choose behaviors that are additionally inflammatory because we're not feeling so good inside in terms of our mental, emotional state.
Or there's a need to distract yourself from your
Yeah, right. You need to be soothed because it doesn't feel good, so it gets worse. Whereas when people are in alignment, they're just living the life. They're not worried. They're not anxious. They just are living. That's the center of their mantras for what they're doing. They're not on a diet. They're not exercising. They're living.
Right. So,
and when they do that, then there's a lot less energy expended. There's a lot less inflammation, and then there's a certain amount of luck, and there's genes, and there's other things. But that's who lives long.
So that Rory's example was someone who was maybe more of an exception than the rule as far as the patient and health. So we had a question.
Exception because he had a strong sense of purpose.
Because he was obviously very robust in many ways, more than the average.
He
yes, that's part of the strength.
He uses filmmaking skills to save the world, essentially. One film at a time. He was very committed and extremely focused, when he was on his mission. He had an amazing, strong sense of mission. It's like a missionary.
And we could all relate to that. When you're doing something that's your passion, how much energy you have. Even if you're sort of sick that day, you may have a lot more energy. And that's an example of how much energy potential we have. And it requires more or less just a clear focus and an idea of what we're going to do with that energy. And then we find it. And then, as you said, we don't self-destruct because we're not upset with what we're doing. We're actually very happy with what we're doing. So it's easy to take care of ourselves then.
Yeah.
But so what I was going to say was that, sure, when you're empowered, so to speak, with that kind of channeling of the energy, everything goes better. But for the, should we say, the average patient that walks in the door, you have the approach of questioning to evoke certain processes, let's say. And we were wondering if, as in your book, the 77 questions are part of your intake, or whether you more intuitively introduce, according to who's sitting in the chair at the moment, what is it that's going to have that impact and evoke this kind of process?
Yeah, well, the 77 questions were a tool that was handed to me. I didn't create it, more or less, by a friend of mine at the American Holistic Medical Association. And it was a tool given to the physicians who were embarking on the accreditation program for certification. And it was a self-reflection tool. And the idea of that tool, which I then sort of adapted for a book, was to understand that it was these sorts of things that are better definition, or better way to define your state of health. What's your relationship to your parents? What's your relationship to your God? What's your feeling in the morning when you wake up? Are you feeling physically attractive? Not are you physically attractive, but do you feel physically attractive? These are reflections on your state of being. So I use those to get people thinking. But in answer to your question, Anton, when I see people, and most of my visits are 2 or 3 hours long, it's through a dialogue. It's through that I add through my own intuitive sense, which I've worked with quite a bit lately, to get out of my own head, to help people sort of see the aspects of themselves that, when viewed clearly, are the navigation tools that they need to get to a higher place. I don't look at pathology. I don't look at disease. I don't keep reminding people of what's wrong. My interest is to help them find health and to remind them of what's working. And one of the things that works for people is their sense of value. Even though some people have low self-esteem, that they have a desire to have a valuable sense, that they're driven to making something of their life. And I encourage people by asking them questions such as, what did you want to do when you were 16 years old? What would you dream of at night when you went to bed? Where are you now? And see that that's the essence of the midlife crisis. To understand without telling them, but to help them see things for themselves so that they feel empowered again to making better choices by clarity. So questions are, to me, somewhat better than answers, because if I gave people the answers, so here's what I see for you, here's what you should do, here's your diet, they write it all down, they memorize the list, they shop with lists, it's on their refrigerator, and they forget, how to make decisions on their own, or that they're capable of doing that. And so it's through that method that I feel I help people see it for themselves, in which case they don't need me after that. I don't see people for years on end or weeks on end. I try to see them once, maybe twice, and then stick by them as a friend would stick by them, but not necessarily as a person providing answers anymore.
Somehow what came to mind, what came to mind was the statement that your whole life is is geared around answering really one particular question. Like for me, it'd be, what is God? That's been just a lifelong circle, and reapproaching it from this angle and that angle, and really not resting till I came into a comprehension of the mystery of it, but not a analytical right brain comprehension, but almost by accident.
And in a way, a question like that, which is so profound, if there was an answer, just to say what obviously is not true, but if there was a simple answer and you got that answer, where would you be after that? In other words,
probably dead.
Well, the idea for me is that we need to have a quest into the mystery, or that's part of the mystery, in order to really keep going. And therefore, we really don't want an answer. We want to have something to keep living for, which is getting closer to the answer and getting closer to that state of being. So the answer is not just an intellectual thing, as you just said, but is a state of awareness, a state of being that feels closer and more in resonance with what you anticipate is the beauty and the magnificence of that place, person, thing, entity, experience, whatever. But it's to get closer to it, because if we ever got there, well, we'd be lying on a beach in sunny California and close our eyes and that'll be it. It would be life after that, if that was achievable, would sort of end. So in a way, we want the challenge. We want to keep having challenges, and that's why I said in my book, and Anton, you mentioned it, is that we can learn from the challenges. There's something meaningful in the life lessons and experiences, even the painful ones, and they actually can enrich us.
That's right.
And that's a very different way than pathologizing symptoms.
Actually, just to follow on from what Rory started to bring there, you mentioned in your book about, as you say, resonance with the bigger field, and the key word is dynamic, that we are, whether we know it or not, we've talked about this in other shows, that we're part of this constantly evolving movement of life. And I know that extends to your personal interest in the cycles, in being part of nature. It's inseparable.
Right.
So to how to get people from an idea of I've got to get rid of this or attain that, and help people get more into the interconnectiveness.
Right.
In my area, in neurofeedback, for example, working with the autonomic nervous system, bringing things into balance, helping people become more adaptable, more resilient, and therefore a little bit more flexible, and not sort of an end place, but a place of continuing, as you were saying. Right. That's really what fascinates me, anyway.
Yeah, I think in helping people sort of get there, it I think is important to remind ourselves, which we tend to be exceptionally committed to our intellects in such a way that we expect that the answer to that question, how to resonate, comes from an intellectual place. So you eat more of this, you eat less of that, you do this, you meditate, you pray. I personally think it's along the lines of a vibrational frequency we're looking to resonate with, using that word resonance, and more like what a member of an orchestra does in getting in attunement with the other players in an orchestra, is that it's almost a feel thing. So I played the clarinet, and so when I played the clarinet, and there would be somebody like the violinist, doing the concert A, and I would move the mouthpiece, or I would change my armature or something away to try to get to that place. It was a feel thing. I wasn't using my brain saying do this, do that. I was, through practice and training, trying to just feel, and that vibration, if I thought about it, and I did, goes through your whole body, because in playing a wind instrument, of course, it's that breath that is actually motivating the sound. And so it's that's how I offer to people to try to get there, is to remind yourself that this is a feel phenomena, not a mind phenomena that we're trying to use to get there. And that's not to dismiss the mind and the intellect and the methodology that you can learn, but is to make sure that you're feeling. And that's where all the things that we do in stillness and in quiet are useful, because we tend to underutilize those muscles.
I think actually I'm sure each of us has had these experiences as healing practitioners, if you will, that sometimes it's the spaces between the words that are most profound, and there are these breakthroughs, these moments where the clinician and the patient gets it. Something happens and opens it up, but you can't describe it, you can't put a name to it, but something comes alive. And in anything, whether you're on a radio show, whether you're in the doctor's office, whether you're in the supermarket, there's these moments that are different, and they make all the difference.
Yeah, and we have these 5 senses in our body, which are rather sophisticated, and we have this very large brain with a lot of sensory input that we again tend to underutilize. When I see my patients in my office, and of course I could do a lot of talking. I could explain a lot, and in 2 or 3 hours there's a lot of messaging in essence. But occasionally during those visits, I'll stop talking and I'll check in with the patient. I'll say, what are you feeling right now? And I'll just ask them to pause and just to see where they're feeling it, what's going on, so that they can incorporate some of that matter into their physical body and use the signals that they're getting, and become aware of them, and as a place to help them navigate back to that awareness, that ability to be clear, and to motivate themselves from a deeper core sense than just the brain.
In a way, you're using questions as a way to facilitate self-awareness, which is absolutely essential for self-care. The self-care that's part of the optimal health, or attaining optimal health. You can't make choices unless there's an awareness of choices that have already been made and the effects of those choices, and what re-navigation might be appropriate, or recalibrate, as the GPS says.
And when you make those choices to feel good about them, earlier I mentioned that word ambivalence. I could give somebody a recommendation: stop eating dairy.
Right.
Most people would sort of choke right then and there.
Ice cream? Are you kidding?
So that they resist that, and that might be the right advice,
Yeah.
but it's not digestible in that method. And so it's very important to help people embrace whatever it is that they wind up doing, whatever they choose. And for a person to choose something like that would normally not feel right initially, they have to see the reasons why themselves. They just can't say because they said. They said, and that would include Dr. Michael Finkelstein, if they said this to me and I don't necessarily believe it, I'm not necessarily going to follow it for that long. But if I get somebody to have that self-awareness, and now they are saying it to themselves, I believe that this is important to me, it's a very different.
Is that like eating dairy and then noticing that you feel sluggish or constipated?
Or to understand how the body operates in response to dairy. And to say, no, I can really appreciate why I do that. Most people know not to drive 110 miles an hour.
Right.
They know what it felt like when they got a little past 85 one day and they got a little freaked out. So they needed to have that experience. So yes, it is very useful to help people remind themselves of what that experience felt like when they were a little out of control. But they have to sort of focus on that one aspect to understand.
I thought this was barely registered on the adolescent brain, but isn't that what evolution is about? How I survived my adolescence, I don't know.
But that's sort of, I was just talking to somebody about that. Adolescent brains, are really important, because without that we wouldn't have exceeded our limits and gotten away with it. Now some adolescents unfortunately don't. That's the sad fact. Yeah. But those who do learn, and they learn that there is a legitimate boundaries at that point, that it's not just they saying don't drive over this speed, that it makes sense for you not to drive that because they did.
Right.
Now some of us accept what the authorities tell us and we just do it, but we don't embrace it quite the same unless we've had that own experience and see for ourselves the reasons for that limit.
Could you tell us a story? Could you bring an example of a patient or someone you've known who's had a very interesting shift, let's say, in their belief systems that led to great results in their lives?
Yeah, let's talk about something sort of positive in general, not a disease, but something that I think is symptomatic of our society's state of health, which is infertility.
Big one.
And going back to Anton, you mentioned that I do really care a lot about the rhythms and cycles of nature. And so one of my first patients, once I started to really branch out and feel good about what I had learned and my newfound skills as a doctor, came to me. She was 31 years old. She had been trying for about 4 or 5 years to get pregnant. She was happily married. She had a good job. And she had gone through years and years of infertility treatments. The first thing I'll say is that there's an epidemic of infertility. I mean, I can't tell you when I was practicing internal medicine in Chappaqua, an affluent suburb of New York, not far from here, where it was very common to hear that, that couples needed the help of doctors and drugs to have their children. And it was clearly growing in frequency. And there's a lot of theories about it. But mine is that we've gotten very disconnected from nature. This woman came in and was describing her life and her story, and it was very clear that she was now at the end of her rope. That she 3 or 4 years of drugs had distorted her body. She was told when to have sex with her husband. This is so contrived, and she wasn't feeling good because she was bloated from the drugs, and she was worried about her future health. I mean, her mission was to have a baby, but she realized she might sacrifice her long-term health by virtue of what she had gone through, not to mention the emotional toll that she was experiencing that day. So she told me about her life. Her husband and she were married about 5 years. He was an investment banker, traveled the world, doing very well. She was a high school basketball coach, very competitive team, also did a lot of traveling, was out all day. They had just moved into an apartment in New York City, and their life was at work, or when they came home, they would go out with friends. So I sort of asked her a question. I said, how much time do you actually spend in your house, her apartment? She said, we're never there. It's a small place, it's New York City, there's so much fun, we've got friends. I asked her one question, and her husband was there at the time. And based on my interview with her this past May when my book came out, because she's featured in my book, I asked her to come back on the anniversary of our first meeting, which was 9 years later. Her twin daughters are now 8 years old. But she was obviously not pregnant at the time, and I asked her one question. I said, would a bird lay an egg if it didn't build a nest? And that's all she needed to hear from me and her husband. According to her interview with me a couple of months ago, she said when they heard that, they knew exactly what they needed to do, that they were never home. And it wasn't because they needed the baby's room like some people do and a place for the baby. They needed to settle down, that her physiology required a home, that her anatomy, her fertility was dependent on her settling down, not necessarily having a room for the baby. 3 months later, she was pregnant with twins. She had the children almost exactly a year after I saw her, and they're happy, healthy twin girls.
Had her fertility treatment stopped? She just
so I gave her some other advice. I said basically after she got it, that she needed to get back in sync with the rhythms of nature. I gave her some other pointers. I said, eat seasonally. I said, think about the relationship between the moon and a woman's menstrual cycle. The moon in Latin the word is menses, and
which is also a month.
Exactly. And so in the 28, 29-day cycle of a typical women's menstrual cycle is no accident that we were born in this natural world, and that our rhythms and cycles reflect that when we swim upstream, I use this, saying often, we diffuse and waste a lot of energy. And so when you're up all night, when you're out all the time, when you're not home, when you don't observe a weekly rhythm, a monthly rhythm, you don't even know what season it is. Some people are more sensitive than others and lose their physiological center point. And in the case of fertility, maybe don't conceive a child that easily. So they spent more time at home. They ate seasonally. She went outside on the nights of the full moon, and she looked at the moon, and she started reading about it. I suggested she consider acupuncture, Chinese medicine, to sort of tweak her physiology a little bit, to experience some nurturing herself, to settle down, to get still. Acupuncture, what I like about acupuncture for some people is it bridges the gap between something that is energy work and something which seems physical to a lot of people. Right. And it forces you to be very still for a while.
Right.
which a lot of
can't
people
move with those needles.
Yeah,
in you.
so it seemed right for this young athletic basketball coach who was anywhere but home. So, and she stopped her fertility treatments, and so she became pregnant.
So what's striking in your story, to me, is there was one question that really touched her.
Right.
And it's kind of mysterious, I think, because we don't know about the process of change, or as they say, a change of heart. We don't know what that is exactly, or we can't explain it exactly, but it goes to another place in us, perhaps. And that's maybe where the kernel of change happens, rather than, well, I guess you could do this and this. And of course, change might be incremental, but still the change of heart seems to be where your skillful physician approach comes into play. The right question touches the right individual.
Yeah. I think it resonates with individuals at that level of common sense and truth. And as a result, it helps people feel clear and strong about their commitment to that part of the process. When you are told take a medication, very few people want that. You might want to get better, and so if you believe the medication is going to cure you, you might do it. But for a lot of people, when it comes to a chronic condition, most people know that taking the medication is just only going to be sort of exchanging one aggravation for another, with a lot of potential unknowns. So it adds even the thought of risk and concern and expense. People would say, I'd rather be able to do something else that doesn't have side effects, that isn't expensive, that isn't going to wed me to you forever as a practitioner. And it's at that level where a good question sometimes helps people. It's sort of like the catalyst for a whole chain of reactions that set in motion this new path.
But it's like, I guess it's kind of like an interruption. The wheel keeps turning, the habitual wheel keeps turning, and there's an interruption. And then the status quo gets shaken up, and then there's an opening for something new.
Right. Well, and you see,
on whatever level, very practical level is...
It's putting on a new lens. Just think about people who have bad vision as a very common thing, who before they put on glasses for the first time, let's think about hundreds of years ago before, the first set of glasses where all people, as they lost their vision, just had to deal with it. But then all of a sudden somebody came along with lenses that you can put over your eyes and now see clearly, and they could not even see something like, the sunrise so clearly anymore. They didn't know that there was this distinct tree out there in the field, or they could see the whatever animals they wanted at a distance. So now all of a sudden the picture becomes clear. It's exciting. And that's excitement is energy. And so when you see clearly, you have energy that often you wouldn't otherwise be able to sort of tap into. And that's a very important part of this healing process, because what we're talking about in terms of the ultimate goal requires perseverance. It requires overcoming challenges. It requires tolerating some of the pain. It takes energy. Most people are so exhausted that they say to themselves, I can't even begin to imagine doing that.
There's a paradox that the people who most need help are least inclined to seek it because their battery is so low.
Yeah.
Don't have the energy to even make the effort to get help.
And for me, it's about helping them put on a new lens and all of a sudden see clearly. When you see clearly, it immediately shifts your energy. It immediately shifts the available energy that you have. And that gives people a sense of hope and optimism that can, I would say, in most people I see in that 2-hour period of time, they come in one way and they leave with a smile.
It's interesting. One of the things that struck me in your book was you had a statement that many doctors are very pessimistic in their way that they deal with their patients. And I never thought of it like that, but I guess when you experience the limitations of that approach, then you know that you're treating symptomatically for the most part. And I have a friend who's an oncologist that I grew up with that just, I don't know how he keeps on going. I mean, he's got great bedside manner, real heart connection with people, and I think that's what gives him, feels like he can make a difference. But the tools that he's working with are just so marginally effective. I mean, there's, can extend life a couple of years. I'm not sure about quality of life sometimes, but I don't know how he's kind of kept his equilibrium himself, because he's except through his just opening of his heart, essentially.
Yeah, no, I think physicians often suffer tremendously because the tools that they're using are so limited that they can't feel great about them quite often, and as a result, this pessimism is pervasive. And the discussion about pathology and disease and the need now, because of the medical legal system, to inform people. It's not to inform people that they're going to die. Mm-hmm. It's, you want to be clear what people can do and have, but if you're limited in terms of what you can see, what you can offer, maybe all you can tell them is how long they're going to live until they die, as opposed to show them what they can live and do. It's a different school.
But when that sort of connects in my mind with this idea of self-acceptance and self-love, particularly people who, let's say, may be told that they don't have long to live, and what would make today a good day to die, as you were saying in your book? What would enrich one's life with all its limitations, given the situation?
Right.
So that's where a real shift would come into play.
Yeah, we live in a culture, unfortunately, it doesn't help us much in that regard. We avoid certain topics like death and dying. We're much more a fan of talking about pain and terror and fear, but the process of death and dying, the subject of the afterlife, people are taught at early ages that those are not really safe subjects to explore and to consider the various options. And that's sort of something I think historians will look back at this period of our culture and say, with all their advances, with all this technology, with all this sophistication, they sort of forgot about something very important, which is that there has to be compassion and understanding of what this process of life is, and even its finite component, and a way to help people consider the meaning and value of their life, no matter how long that is. That it can't just be this as we were talking before the show, anti-aging, anti-cancer, anti-death mentality, because when we put that prefix in front of a word, we really emphasize the word quite a bit, and we send the focus there, but not in a healthy way, not in a way that can be digested, not in a way to see beyond it or to understand its value and contribution to the life we're living now, but in a way to add fear and engender antipathy towards something. And that's not skillful.
Actually, ironically, I think you also say this in the book. Some people are, quotation marks, already dead, and they're not even about to die physically, right, because there's something missing in their life. Right. It's just existing.
Well, when you stop, just like a shark, when a shark stops swimming, it dies. When we start living, we die.
When we start living?
Stop living.
Oh, stop living, okay.
Yeah, we die.
Yeah, I mean...
So the emphasis has to be on the living. And so I've seen people with diseases, with terminal conditions. We all have a terminal condition, but with one that's maybe more predictably sooner than later, stop living because of the fear, the anxiety, as opposed to a physician saying, this is a great time in your life now to sort of reprioritize and spend time with your children, your grandchildren, to drop all the treadmills that you've been running on and sort of plug in someplace else to something that's beautiful. And the fact is that I'm not telling you to sort of hang it up and and rest, but that process will return your energies. And in fact, if there's healing potential, that's how you're going to maximize your healing potential, by plugging back into the positive, not by running from the negative.
So you've had your own stories of turnarounds,
yes,
right, with patients?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much time we have, but
we have time.
So, I mean, one of my most, I think, dramatic lessons, because of the patient that I was when I first to try this approach out with, and I say that with humility and respect to the individuals and all the people that I learned from. But I saw a 71-year-old man who had metastatic cancer, spread all over his body, lungs, liver, somewhere in the middle of his abdomen, all over. And he came to me because he thought that maybe I can talk to him about some alternative treatments and extend his life. And getting back to your original question, some people come to me with that as what's on their mind. I do what I can to give them that answer, but I also try to put it in a different context, which is I might be able to help you extend your life, give you other remedies to think about, but what I really want to do is get you back into the subject of living. I really want you to, start emphasizing what's working and make sure you're living your life, because who knows? There have been a lot of predictions that have been wrong. And so I don't want to hex you the way the medical establishment tends to hex people by giving them predictions. I don't want to ignore the realities, but I want to be fair. But so this man came to me, and that was his comment, and I listened to him for 3 hours. He was one of the people that came in, as some people do, with well-organized medical documentation. So he had 2 loose leaves. Each one was like 3 or 4 inch binders of his medical records. And he proceeded to go through them pretty thoroughly with me to say, here's what's happened to me, here's where my disease is. And in addition to having this cancer, he was also an alcoholic and had liver disease. He had cirrhosis of the liver, which was not helping. And so when I was listening and I put this case together, his situation together, I thought to myself that the liver, even though it's not clear where this tumor has begun, but the liver seems to be the center of his medical problem. In my new schooling, I understood that the liver, at least from a Chinese medicine point of view, is associated with the emotion of anger. So after 3 hours of talking to me, I said to him, Stephen, seems to me, on top of the medical stuff that you're dealing with and how hard that is, there's something very important that you're angry about. And he cried. 71-year-old man, not what I expected, just broke down and cried. Well, the backstory in all of this was that because of his alcoholism, when 10 years ago or so, he had a young son. He was married then, and his wife decided to divorce him and got a court order to protect their son from the father, who was an alcoholic and not taking good care of himself. And as a result, he didn't see his son for 10 years. His son was now 19. And he was really angry. He was angry initially, he would say, at his wife, ex-wife. But what he was really angry at was himself, for the way he took care of himself or didn't take care of himself and abused himself. And that was eating him up. Literally speaking, was eating him up. Well, he immediately, after that visit and that question, realized that his path to extraordinary health was through the dealing with his anger, that his medical condition was hinged upon how well he did. So he and I met every week, and this is not what I usually do because most people don't want to see me that often, quite honestly, but he felt value in me really getting to the bottom of this with him. And I worked on him with his own self-destructive behavior and his own thoughts, eventually how to reposition himself in the eyes of his son. And 8 months later, still just doing a lot of personal work, his tumor started to regress. He started to move around more easily. He started to talk about driving again. He was not driving because he was relatively incapable of driving. He was talking about making love to women. He was like getting back into living. A month later, he wasn't getting any therapy, by the way. His doctors wrote him off that he was no longer treatable, and because of his self-destructive behavior, his alcohol use, and he was also abusing cocaine. He was an interesting
real hard case,
individual. His physicians fired him, so he wasn't getting any treatments, but he was starting to get better. 8-9 months later, his son calls him and tells him that he's coming to visit after all this work, because he had really made an effort and it was clear. And his son came, and they had an amazing day. And what I learned about at the funeral was on the last day of his life, the day that his son visited him, he dropped dead and died on the way up to bed with a smile on his face. And I learned about that at the eulogy when his son said, "Thank God I met my father." And some people could look at this story and say, it's a story of failure. The man died. But he was actually better and healthier, and he was living, and he got back to his son. And that was important not only to him, but clearly to his son. And he accomplished what I believe he needed to in this life, which was to heal his self-destruction and to understand the meaning of his life and the importance of relationships.
What you're illustrating is the difference between a cure and healing.
That's right.
And healing was getting right with life, getting right with his
right.
ex and everybody else that he it separated from, and that happened, and,
Right.
and it's almost like mission accomplished.
Right.
Okay, I can leave now.
Right. Now, most of us would say, I'd like to do both. I'd like to
Yeah.
heal that, and I'd like to
Sometimes
survive
it is
too.
for that, yeah.
But our emphasis on cure, our emphasis on fixing problems, sometimes is sort of lost, or loses us in the forest, where we miss the beauty of it, and we sort of wind up getting to some place, but it's not really where we feel in the end is really where we want to be. Mm-hmm. We solve a problem and create 3 new ones, as opposed to overcoming it all. One thing we're not going to overcome is the finite nature of living, but we can emphasize our lives and learn from our challenges and ask questions. What is this offering me?
And getting to the core
Yes.
of your life.
Right.
Better late than never.
Right. And frequently it's in other systems where they correlate symptoms with particular questions. So if you had an earache, chronic earache, not just an acute one necessarily, I might ask you, what are you afraid to listen to? If your eyes are bothering you, what don't you want to see? You know, these are abstract sounding questions, and sometimes people will be furious with me if I ask that question as if I'm ignoring the pain.
Right.
But I'm not. I'm really saying that, no, it's through some questions like that, especially when it's a chronic condition, that you can finally get around the symptom. If your body is trying to give you a message and you're not listening to it, then it's going to keep sending you that signal. So I don't say this for an acute problem. You know, if you have strep throat, get an antibiotic. I mean, that's, you know, if you get hit by a car, you go to a hospital and you get treated. But there are chronic conditions which don't work that neatly. Like the Western medical model is not that good, and we all know it. So it's good to then sort of step back and look and start asking other questions, like what would somebody else say about this from another culture at another time? And we often will get some insight that is very valuable. That's the medicine that I practice now, and I think that's the medicine of the future. You know, understanding symptoms in a different way.
I think both patients and many doctors sort of consider it a problem solution, you know, medical mechanic, I think you
Right.
referred to it, and I think it takes a certain shift on both parts to get out of that paradigm, which can allow this other more subtle, more profound stuff to happen. Right. The tendency is to, you know, fix me.
Right.
And for the practitioner to take pride in being able to fix you, you know, and it just gets perpetuated.
I think if it's a simple broken part, like a broken leg, get fixed. That's fine. But I think, in addition to that question, there ideally is the question: what else can I learn from this? Because sometimes fixing is not the easiest thing to do, or it won't ever happen necessarily. But we can always learn. And if you walk into a doctor's office and say, "Fix me only," then that's what you're going to get. If you say, "Fix me, but also remind me if there's something else I might pay attention to," as you know, that this ailment, this symptom may be offering. Now, doctors taught in the Western medical model are not going to give you that answer, because this is not something that's you know, in their curriculum. On the other hand, there are other people in our world, the two of you, myself, there's many other people who are more than willing to sit down and say, how else can we look at this and understand it? And that is a good idea for most people. Not to put all the eggs in the basket of the Western medical doctors that they see, but is to step back and look for those people, and maybe a group of people, that offer them the more holistic appreciation for all the things that they're experiencing.
Well, actually, it brings us full circle to the question of self-help and making that effort.
Right.
Because it can be described as laziness just to say, "Fix me, doctor,"
Right.
or, you know, "Give me a pill. I don't really want to take any part in this. I'm helpless."
Well, we do that all the time. We go to professionals all the time to sort of bail us out of predicaments. And we often are very appreciative, and we should be thankful that there are people like that that can help us. But when you use that phrase, self-help, help do what? So if it's just to fix my physical body, like I take a car into my mechanic, that's not sufficient. If we have a great physical body, and we see many role models out there, athletes who have great physical bodies who have broken lives. And so is that what we want, a great physical body? Or we want a decent physical body that's not in a lot of pain, any more pain than we need to, but a way of using our mind, our mental energy, our spiritual, more metaphysical, existential existence to do something meaningful in this life and to have great relationships, which is not only to each other, but to ourselves, the natural world, and to something beyond it all. That, I think, is the ultimate goal, and that's what that's what I think what we need help for. In which case, you don't go to a doctor for that any more than you go to your accountant for that.
Well, the physical malady often is what gets your attention. Finally.
Yeah, and so it's useful.
It's a portal.
Yeah, it brings you in the door.
Useful change.
Yeah, and it's good, and we're all going to have those, and it's not again to sort of ignore the pain that people experience and dismiss it. I really want to keep emphasizing that. I'm not about insensitive to the plight that people face when they're in pain. However, I think the way out of pain, especially when a doctor isn't enough, is to go beyond conventional medicine and start asking, exploring other questions, and to ask the big picture question, which is, so what am I going to learn from this, and where am I really going?
If I'm not my diagnosis, who am I?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. We're not the disease as we label ourselves with.
I mean, this is also, of course, about education. So some people may not even know to ask the questions to themselves.
Right.
Other people may, and then it's a question of whether they have the motivation to get out of their little box, self-limiting boxes. That's, of course, where someone like you would come in as a facilitator. But again, it comes down to self-help, making the effort, and making a regular effort, because habits are very strong, as we've discussed many times on our shows, the power of habits and how to find another approach.
That's right.
To break that cycle. So I guess it's for people who want to work.
Yeah, there is work involved. However, one can get a little bit more excited about work, because work sometimes has a negative connotation, if they appreciate
explore
how exciting it could be, because when the dots start getting connected and you start feeling better, it has immediate benefits. So that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. The wheels turn. So how are we doing on time?
Time to wrap. Time to find out how people can reach Michael.
Yes, so would you like to give out some contact information about yourself?
Sure. So I could be emailed at michael@sunraven.org, sun like the sun in the sky, raven the bird.org. And the website for me is areyoutakingcareofyourself.com. And through there are those letters that you mentioned and other things that I write and information about my practice. And I'm more than happy to speak to anyone and everyone about their particular situations and offer what I can. And my book is available at the usual places.
Why don't you say that title again?
77 Questions for Skillful Living, A New Path to Extraordinary Health. And it was published by William Morrow in May. And it does represent years of this type of thinking, and I hope to help people, even without seeing me, organize themselves in their own approach to this project, which is a better life.
Years of practice, too, I might add. It shows.
It's a life experience. I would say every bit of life that I've experienced, including my own losses. I was in a terrible accident when I was 20, and gained a lot of perspective from understanding how fleeting and vulnerable life is, and how precious it is. And it's at the heart of everything that I do.
Beautiful. I'm Rory Pinto. You can reach me at roarstar@aol.com and soon rorypinto.com. It's a website that I've been working on for 9 months and is almost ready for launch.
And I'm Anton Bluman. Please visit me at mindcarecenter.net. And this has been New Perspectives Radio. Thank you.
It's not just radio, it's Rockland World Radio. RocklandWorldRadio.com